Ben Walker has never been a man who believed in karma. He has said this out loud, more than once, in the specific, self-congratulatory tone of a man who mistakes the absence of consequences for the absence of their existence. He said it at dinners. He said it to friends who laughed because laughing was easier than disagreeing with Ben. He said it most memorably on the night he sat across from his wife Ren at the kitchen table they had bought together at a weekend market in their first year of marriage, and told her, with the rehearsed calm of someone who had been preparing this speech for considerably longer than he was admitting, that he was done. That the marriage had run its course. That he had been unhappy for some time. That the honorable thing, and Ben always found a way to call his decisions honorable, was to say so now rather than later. Ren did not cry. This was, apparently, one of the things that had bothered Ben about her. She was not dramatic. She did not throw things or raise her voice or perform the kind of dissolution that would have made him feel that leaving was more justified than it was. She looked at him across the table and she said, quietly, "I know this isn't really about happiness." Ben had found this difficult to answer, which was the real reason he had moved out 3 days later rather than 2 weeks later as planned. What he did not know, sitting at that kitchen table delivering his practice speech, was that in 6 weeks he would meet a woman at a rooftop event in Nashville who moved through rooms like someone who had decided she was the most interesting person in any of them. That the woman's name was Melissa. That Melissa had a laugh that landed in a man's chest like a claim. That she had a Caucasian mother who had raised her in the American South and a Korean father who had barely been present during her childhood, and that the space left by his absence had given her a quality of restless, electric need that Ben would mistake, fatally, for the freedom he had convinced himself he was looking for. That 3 months after their meeting he would propose. That she would say yes with the decisive speed of someone who had already made this calculation before the question arrived. That 7 months after the proposal he would be standing at an altar in a venue that cost more than his previous car, listening to the words that would bind him to Melissa Choi. And that at the reception, for the first time, he would meet her father. Do-young Choi arrived at his daughter's wedding in a dark suit that communicated, without any additional accessory, that its wearer was not a man anyone in the room was going to misidentify as ordinary. He arrived with 2 men whose function was understood without explanation. He arrived and the room adjusted, not noisily, not with any dramatic parting of the crowd, but with the subtle, instinctive reorganization of people who have registered something that requires recalibration. Ben Walker watched his father-in-law cross the reception hall and felt, for the first time in several years, something he had successfully avoided since approximately the kitchen table conversation. He felt afraid. The karma he didn't believe in had been patient. It had waited precisely the right amount of time. And it had arrived not with thunder or dramatic announcement but in a dark suit, with 2 men flanking it, and the unhurried certainty of something that had always been coming. My name is Ren Walker, or rather, Ren Calloway, which is the name I went back to immediately and which fits me considerably better. This is not my story of victimhood. It is Ben's story, which I am in a position to tell because several of the people involved told me themselves, and because what happened to Ben Walker after he left me is the most precisely constructed lesson in consequence I have ever witnessed from a comfortable distance. I am going to tell all of it. And I am going to tell it without a single ounce of guilt. Subscribe before this goes any further. Because the moment Ben Walker shakes Do-young Choi's hand at that reception and looks into his father-in-law's eyes for the first time, that moment has a context that Ben doesn't have yet and you need to already be here when he gets it. To understand what Ben Walker lost, you have to understand what he had. And to understand what he had, you have to understand Ren Calloway, because Ren is the beginning and the end and the standard by which everything that follows is measured, whether Ben ever acknowledged that or not. Ren grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee,
All right, team, check
the daughter of a school librarian and a civil engineer who had, between them, built a life of the specific, durable kind, not spectacular, not precarious, but solid in the way that things built by people who respect both craft and patience are solid. She studied communications at Vanderbilt, worked in nonprofit development for 6 years, and had the particular quality of a person who has learned to find meaning in the work rather than in the recognition of the work, which means she was often the most effective person in any room and rarely the most loudly credited for it. She met Ben Walker at 28. He was 31, a sales director at a commercial real estate firm, with a jaw that photographed well and a charisma that operated most effectively on people who had not yet spent enough time with him to understand that it was consistent regardless of whether the occasion warranted it. He was charming at her expense and attentive when attention served his purposes and funny in the way of men who have discovered that being funny is a management strategy rather than an expression of genuine humor. Ren was not naive. She has said, since, that she understood the category of person Ben was within the first year, and that she spent the next 4 years believing the category was the surface version and the real version was the man she occasionally glimpsed underneath, the one who was genuinely moved by certain music and made the best eggs of anyone she had ever encountered and called his mother every Sunday evening without fail. She was not entirely wrong about that version. It existed. What she misjudged was the proportion, how much of a person the better version occupied, and whether that proportion was increasing or decreasing over time. By year 5, the proportion had been decreasing for 2 years. The specific diminishment was not dramatic. It was the accumulation of small choices that each, individually, could be explained away and that together constituted something that could not. The credit taken in rooms where her work had made the credit possible. The dismissal of her priorities as smaller than his priorities without the argument ever being explicitly made. The specific, eroding quality of living with someone who had decided they deserved more than you were capable of providing, though they had never said it directly and would have denied it if confronted. The kitchen table conversation was not a surprise. It was the conclusion of something that had been in progress for a long time, and Ren received it the way she received most things, with clarity rather than chaos, with the knowledge that the clarity would cost her later, privately, in ways Ben would never see. She told him, "I know this isn't really about happiness." She was right, of course. It was about Melissa. Ben had been at the rooftop event 3 weeks before the kitchen table conversation. He had not told Ren this. He was not the kind of man who would. He moved out. He filed for divorce with the brisk efficiency of someone moving on to a project they consider more promising. He told people that the marriage had simply run its course, that they had grown in different directions, that sometimes the right thing is to acknowledge what isn't working and move forward. He told this story so consistently and with such polished delivery that several people who knew both of them came to believe it. Not Ren's friends. But several people. Melissa Choi was, on first encounter and for a sustained second and third encounter, exactly what Ben had decided he was looking for. She was beautiful in a way that was both striking and specific. She had inherited her Korean father's bone structure and her Caucasian mother's coloring, and the combination produced a face that people looked at twice. She was confident with the particular, charged confidence of a woman who had grown up with one absent parent and had decided, early and deliberately, that she was never going to need anything she didn't provide for herself. She was interesting and she knew it, and she used it with the skill of someone who had understood since adolescence that being interesting was power. What she was not, though Ben would not understand this for several months, was peaceful. Ren had been peaceful. This was the quality Ben had identified as insufficiency, as a lack of challenge, a lack of excitement, a lack of the electrical current he felt he required in a relationship. He had not understood, until considerably later and at considerable cost, that peace was not the absence of depth. It was the presence of safety. And that the electrical current he was looking for had a different name in the vocabulary of people who had experienced enough of it to recognize it. The different name was instability. He would learn this gradually, in the way that people learn things they have been actively avoiding learning, slowly at first and then all at once, in the specific, clarifying moment when the full picture finally assembles and the assembling cannot be undone. That moment arrived at a wedding reception, in the form of a dark suit and two men who didn't need to explain their function, and a handshake from a man named Du-Young Choi. The rooftop event was a product launch for a commercial real estate firm that had recently expanded into Nashville from Atlanta. Ben attended in his professional capacity. These were the events that generated the kind of contacts his work depended on, and he was good at them in the way of men who have built a professional persona that operates effectively at exactly this altitude of social interaction. He noticed Melissa within 12 minutes of arriving. He would later say 25, because 12 minutes sounds like the kind of speed that requires explanation, and Ben preferred his narrative to sound considered rather than impulsive. But the truth was 12 minutes, because she was standing near the bar in a black dress that had been selected with the precision of someone who understood exactly what they were doing with the selection, and she was talking to two men who were both paying her the full attention that she expected and was already finding mildly insufficient. She noticed him noticing her, which was also something that happened at the 12-minute mark, and her response to being noticed by Ben Walker was to turn toward the view of the Nashville skyline rather than toward him, which was the correct strategic choice and which Ben, who was used to responses that were more immediately rewarding, found immediately compelling. He made his way over. He said something about the view. She said something about the view that was better than what he'd said and didn't look at him while she said it. He laughed. She allowed the slight beginning of a smile and redirected her eyes toward the skyline again. This is the choreography of certain kinds of attraction, a sequence that feels spontaneous and is entirely managed, at least from one side. Ben felt, by the end of the conversation, that he had accomplished something. He did not consider that the feeling of accomplishment was also part of the management. They exchanged numbers. Ben drove home that night to the apartment he had not yet shared with Ren that he was planning to leave her for, and felt the specific combination of guilt and excitement that he had learned to manage by concentrating on the excitement. He told Ren 3 weeks later. He cited unhappiness. He cited growing in different directions. He cited the honorable choice, though honor in this context was doing a great deal of work for very little compensation. Ren said what she said. He moved out. Melissa was not from Nashville. She had been living there for 8 months, having relocated from Charlotte following what she described to Ben, in the early weeks of their relationship, as the conclusion of a situation that had required a new geography. She did not elaborate immediately, and Ben, who preferred not to receive information that would complicate the picture he was building, did not press. What he did receive, in the early weeks and months, was the electrical current he had been looking for. Melissa was not quiet. She was not settled. She operated at a frequency that required constant engagement and produced, in the person engaged, the feeling of being fully alive that people sometimes confuse with happiness and is actually closer to vigilance. She had opinions about everything and most of them were expressed as settled conclusions rather than perspectives. She had preferences that were not preferences in the ordinary sense but requirements, and the management of those requirements was structured into the relationship from the beginning in a way that Ben, who was accustomed to managing less rather than more in his relationships, found challenging in the early period and then normalized. He met her mother, Lorraine, at 6 weeks. Lorraine Choi was a woman from Knoxville who had married a Korean man 20 years her junior, produced 1 daughter, and spent the subsequent years managing the specific, complicated aftermath of a marriage that had been more adventure than planned and had not, in the long term, sustained itself. Lorraine was warm and forthcoming and made exceptional food and was, Ben noted, slightly nervous in a way he could not immediately attribute to anything specific. He asked Melissa about her father at the 8-week mark. Casually, the way you ask about a parent you have not been introduced to and have not seen mentioned in any photograph in the apartment. Melissa said he was Korean. She said he had not been very present during her childhood. She said they had a relationship now that was complicated, her word, said with the specific flatness of a person who has decided that one word is all the subject deserves. Ben said he looked forward to meeting him sometime. Melissa looked at him for a moment with the expression she made when she was running a calculation she preferred not to share. "You will," she said. "Eventually." He did not understand the specific wait in eventually for several more months. By the time he understood it, the proposal had happened, the venue had been booked, the invitations had been sent, and the understanding was no longer actionable in the direction he would have liked it to be actionable. The first specific clue arrived 8 months into the relationship, on a Sunday evening when Melissa received a phone call that changed the quality of the apartment's air before she had spoken a single word in response. She took the call in the bedroom with the door closed. When she came out 20 minutes later, she was composed in the specific way of someone who has performed composure rather than achieved it. "My father," she said. "He's coming to Nashville next month." Ben said something appropriate about being glad to finally meet him. Melissa looked at him with the calculation expression again. "He wants to meet you too," she said. And then, after a pause that Ben did not give sufficient weight at the time, "He has questions about you." "What kind of questions?" Ben asked. "He always has questions," she said. And went to the kitchen to start dinner. The meeting with Do-young Choi was arranged by Melissa with the specific, logistical precision she brought to anything she considered high stakes. She chose the restaurant, a Korean establishment in the Gulch that had the particular, expensive quietness of a place where serious conversations were intended to happen. She chose the time, 7 p.m. on a Thursday, which was not a casual dinner time, which communicated in advance that this was not a casual dinner. She dressed in a manner that Ben interpreted as effort and which was, he would later understand, closer to presentation. Ben arrived, as he always arrived to things he was mildly nervous about, with the performance of not being mildly nervous, the easy walk, the settled posture, the smile that said "I am a man who is comfortable in most situations." He had been told nothing specific about Melissa's father beyond what he had assembled from inference and the one sentence Lorraine had offered during a subsequent visit: "Do-young is a man with very particular ideas about how things should be." Lorraine had said this with the careful neutrality of someone who had spent 20 years revising her language about a subject in order to be accurate without being actionable. Do-young Choi was already seated when they arrived. He was a man in his early 60s who looked 10 years younger with the specific physical authority of someone whose body had been maintained not as a vanity project but as an operational requirement. He was not large in the intimidating sense, he was lean, with the compact, precise quality of something that had been refined down to its essential function. He wore a dark jacket over a plain shirt and he sat with the stillness of a person who had decided a long time ago that movement for its own sake was unnecessary. He looked at Ben the way certain people look at things they are in the process of assessing, completely, without the performance of casualness, with the full and unself-conscious weight of someone who does not consider scrutiny to be an imposition. "Ben Walker," he said. Not a greeting. An identification. The tone of a man who already knew the name and was now matching it to the face. "Mr. Choi," Ben said, and extended his hand with the warm, confident grip of a man who had been told his handshake was an asset. Do-young Choi shook it. He did not perform warmth in return. He shook it with the specific, contained grip of a man who understood exactly what handshakes communicated and chose his communication deliberately. They sat. Melissa ordered. The conversation began. What Ben experienced over the following 90 minutes was something he would describe to a friend the following day as intensive. The actual description, from a neutral observer, would have been closer to a structured interview conducted by someone who had done their preparation. Do-young asked about Ben's work with the specific, informed quality of someone who already knew the general shape of the answers and was checking for accuracy. He asked about Ben's family, not conversationally, but with the focused interest of someone building a file. He asked about Ben's previous marriage with a directness that Ben had not been prepared for and that Melissa appeared to have expected, given that she showed no surprise. "You were married before," Du-young said. "Not a question." "Yes," Ben said. "For 5 years. It ended, we both moved on." "What ended it?" Ben gave the version. "The growing in different directions. The mutual acknowledgement. The honorable choice." Du-young listened. He looked at Ben while he listened with the expression of a man who had spent decades evaluating what people said and what they chose not to say and had developed considerable fluency in the gap between the two. "Your ex-wife," Du-young said. "How does she feel about the divorce?" Ben said he believed they had both made peace with it. Du-young held his gaze for a moment. Then he moved to another subject, smoothly, in the way of someone who has marked a point in the conversation and will return to it on their own schedule. By the end of the dinner, Ben had the specific, processed quality of a man who has been through something more rigorous than he anticipated and is reconstructing his composure. He had performed well, he thought. He had been articulate and warm and appropriately modest and had made Melissa laugh at one point which he hoped had registered favorably. In the car afterward, he asked Melissa what she thought. She was quiet for a moment. "He's thinking," she said. "About what?" "About you," she said. "About whether you're what you say you are." Ben said that he hoped he had made a good impression. Melissa looked at the road. "He doesn't give impressions," she said. "He gives verdicts. Eventually." Ben laughed. He seemed like a tough audience. But reasonable. Melissa did not laugh. She looked out the window for a moment. "My father is many things," she said. "Reasonable is not on the list." She said it without emphasis. Not as a warning, as a statement of fact. The flat accuracy of someone describing something they have known for a very long time and have made their peace with in the specific way that people make peace with things that cannot be changed. Ben drove home. He told himself the meeting had gone well. He told himself this with the confidence of a man who had not yet understood what well meant in Du-young Choi's vocabulary, and what the standard was against which well was measured, and what happened to the things that fell short of that standard. He would understand all of this. It would just take a little more time. Du-young Choi gave Ben Walker 90 minutes at dinner and zero warmth. He asked about Ben's first marriage with a precision that Melissa was clearly expecting. Subscribe, because what Du-young learned about Ben Walker before that dinner ever happened is the part of this story Ben still doesn't know about. Ben Walker proposed to Melissa on a Tuesday evening in October, on the rooftop of the same building where they had met, which he considered romantic symmetry and which Melissa received with the decisive speed of someone who had been running the calculation for some time and had already arrived at the answer. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Not breathless yes, not tearful yes, decisive yes, the yes of a woman who had decided and was now confirming. Ben interpreted this as passion. It was efficient. They were engaged for 7 months. In those 7 months, Ben met Du-young Choi on 2 additional occasions. The second meeting was a dinner at a private restaurant in Atlanta where Du-young happened to be conducting business. Happened to be the framing Melissa used, though she used it with the specific neutrality that told Ben the happening was not accidental. Du-young was accompanied by 3 men on this occasion. They were seated at adjacent tables and they did not eat. This was the first time Ben noticed the function without explanation quality of the men Du-young moved with, and he filed it in the category of significant business operations and left it there. The dinner conversation was easier than the first, not warm, but less interrogative, the difference between being assessed and being placed. Du-young asked Ben about the wedding plans with the air of a man reviewing a project update. He suggested, without framing it as a suggestion, that the venue might be reconsidered in favor of one he had a relationship with. Melissa agreed immediately. Ben, who had spent 3 weeks coordinating the original venue with the wedding planner, also agreed immediately, without understanding why the speed of his own agreement surprised him slightly. The third meeting was the week before the wedding. Du-young was in Nashville for the final preparations. He requested that Ben join him for coffee on a Wednesday morning, alone, without Melissa, at the hotel where he was staying. Ben arrived at 8:30. He was dressed carefully. He had prepared what he thought were the right things to say, about his commitment to Melissa, about his plans for their life together, about the respect he had for Du-young and hoped to earn in return. These were the sentences he had rehearsed on the drive over. Du-young did not give him an opportunity to deliver any of them. He poured coffee. He placed a folder on the table. He opened it. Inside the folder was a summary of Ben Walker's history. Not a private investigator's dramatic dossier, something more precise than that. A document that had been assembled with the specific, methodical thoroughness of someone who had access to more than public records and who had been building it since the third week after Ben's first name had been mentioned in connection with his daughter. Ben looked at the document and felt his rehearsed sentences evaporate. "I know about your first marriage," Du-young said. "I know its duration. I know how it ended and why. I know the version you tell people, and I know what Ren Calloway has said to the people she trusts, which is different from the version you tell." He looked at Ben with the still, complete attention Ben had first encountered across a restaurant table. "I know about the 2 years before the divorce and what those years cost her. I know about the specific nature of a man who does not raise his voice but consistently removes dignity until there is nothing left to take." The silence in the room was the most complete silence Ben Walker had experienced as an adult. "You are going to marry my daughter on Saturday," Du-young said. "This is because she has decided to marry you and because her choices are hers to make and because I raised her to know her own mind even when I was not present to witness it. I do not override her decisions." He paused. "What I do is ensure that the people in her life understand the nature of their position." Ben managed to speak. He said something about the divorce being more complicated than any summary could capture, that Ren had her perspective and he had his, that both of them had contributed to the marriage's difficulties. Du-young let him finish. He did not react to the content. He simply said, "I have spoken with Ren Calloway." Ben went very still. "She did not speak unkindly," Du-young said. "She is not a woman given to unkindness." That was clear from 5 minutes of conversation. It was also clear within those 5 minutes what she had spent 5 years managing and what it had cost her. Ben said, because he could not yet stop himself from performing even in the moments when performance was visibly not working, "I understand this is your daughter and you want to protect her." "Yes," Du-young said. "I want to protect her." He closed the folder. He looked at Ben with the expression of a man who has completed the informational portion of a meeting and is now communicating something that does not require documents. "I also want you to understand something very clearly before Saturday." "What's that?" "Melissa is not Ren," he said. "Melissa has my temperament. She is not patient in the way that patient women are patient. She is not generous in the way that generous women are generous. She will not absorb things quietly. She will return them." He paused. "And I will be watching. Not occasionally. Consistently. In ways you will not always be able to see." He picked up his coffee. "I thought you should know the shape of your life going forward." Ben Walker drove to the venue walkthrough that afternoon in a silence that was the opposite of the comfortable kind. The wedding was held on a Saturday in early May at a venue that Du-young had selected and that was beautiful in the particular, curated way of spaces that have been assembled by someone with both resources and taste and an interest in communicating both without making the communication the point. 300 guests. The ceremony was formal and precise, Melissa had organized it with the same efficiency she brought to everything she considered high stakes, and it unfolded according to her design with the minimum of deviation. Ben stood at the altar in a morning coat he had been told he would be wearing and said the words he had been told he would say and received, from Melissa, the decisive quality of her commitment with the same efficiency she had offered the yes on the rooftop. He was, at the altar, genuinely moved. This is worth noting because it is the honest part of the story. Ben Walker had genuine feelings for Melissa, whatever the complications of the broader picture. She was compelling in a way he had not encountered before, and the altar, on the morning of the wedding before the reception and before the folder had finished rearranging his understanding of his situation, felt like the beginning of something he could build correctly this time. Wren would say, later, that this was the most Ben Walker thing about the whole situation. His capacity for genuine feeling without any corresponding capacity for the behavior that genuine feeling was supposed to produce. The ceremony concluded. The photographs happened. The guests moved to the reception space, which had the specific, high-end warmth of a room that had been designed to feel like celebration and succeeded. And then Du Young arrived. He had not been at the ceremony. Ben had noted this with a relief he had not examined too carefully. At the ceremony, he had been able to be the groom, the center of the room's attention, comfortable in his role, performing the version of himself that worked best in exactly these conditions. Du Young arrived at the reception with two men Ben had not previously seen. Not the men from the Atlanta dinner, these were different, younger, with the same function without explanation quality but fresher in it, the way a newer version of something is still recognizably the same thing. The room adjusted when he entered. Not dramatically, subtly, the way rooms adjust when the ambient authority in the space increases. Ben was speaking with a colleague from the real estate firm when he became aware of the adjustment and turned. Du Young was crossing the room. He was dressed in a dark suit that had the specific quality of clothing that has been made rather than bought. He was not looking at Ben. He was scanning the room the way a person scans a room when they are its primary point of organization regardless of whose name was on the invitation. He found Ben's eyes. He crossed to him. He extended his hand. Ben shook it. And in the handshake, which was the same precise, contained grip as the first meeting, the full weight of the Wednesday morning coffee conversation settled into Ben's chest in a way it had not fully settled during the conversation itself. "Congratulations," Du Young said. "Thank you," Ben said. "I'm glad you're here." Du Young looked at him for a moment. Not unkindly, without warmth, which was a different thing. "Are you?" he said. Not quite a question. He moved on to find Melissa, which he did with the directness of a man who had been looking for her from the moment he arrived. Ben watched his father-in-law cross the room toward his new wife and observed the specific, complicated quality of Melissa receiving her father, not warm, not cold, but layered in the way of relationships that contain a lifetime of negotiated terms. She kissed his cheek. He held her by both shoulders and looked at her face with an expression that was the most human thing Ben had seen on him, something ancient and complicated and specifically paternal. Ben's colleague appeared at his elbow. "That your father-in-law?" "Yes," Ben said. "Intense guy," his colleague said. "What does he do?" Ben said real estate and import-export, which were the categories Melissa had given him and which were accurate in the way that the visible tenth of an iceberg is an accurate representation of the iceberg. "He came in with two guys who looked like security," his colleague said. "He's a successful man," Ben said. "Successful people have security." He said it with the specific, performed ease of a man who is working very hard to believe his own sentence. Later, during the toasts, Du Young rose and delivered something that was the length and form of a father of the bride toast and that contained, woven into the conventional language of such toasts, a series of sentences that operated on two registers simultaneously. Publicly they were wishes for the couple. Underneath, they were something Ben heard very clearly and that the other 300 guests heard only as sentiment. He spoke about Melissa's strength. About her expectation of being treated correctly. About the long memory of the Choi family for both kindness and its absence. He looked at Ben during the last sentence in a way that the room interpreted as affectionate and that Ben interpreted accurately. He raised his glass. Ben raised his. They drank. And Ben Walker, who had never believed in karma, sat in the most expensive room he had ever occupied and understood, with a clarity that had arrived too late to be useful, that he had married someone his own strategies would not work on, under the supervision of a man who already knew every strategy he had and had been managing more dangerous strategies than his for 40 years. He had left peace. He had married its opposite. And the author of that opposite was watching from across the room with the specific patience of a man who had decided that watching was the only intervention the situation currently required. Ben Walker sat at his own wedding reception listening to a toast that was speaking directly to him while the other 300 guests heard something entirely different. Subscribe, because what Do Young Choi does in the first month of Ben and Melissa's marriage, without ever entering their apartment, is the part that proves he is playing a longer game than anyone understood. Marriage, as it turned out, suited Ben Walker considerably less in its second iteration than it had in its first. The specific irony of this would not have been lost on anyone who understood the dynamic of his first marriage, where Ren had been accommodating and patient and had absorbed the erosion of being with someone who treated accommodation as license. Ben now found himself in a marriage where the accommodation was entirely absent and every behavior that had operated successfully with Ren produced immediate and proportionate response. He was late to dinner. Melissa did not make it again. She left his portion, at room temperature, in a container labeled with his name and the time he had said he would be home, which was more pointed than any argument. He made a dismissive comment about a decision she had made. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had heard the comment, assessed it, and decided on a response that was significantly more effective than anger. She said, "Don't do that again." No volume. No heat. The flat certainty of a statement rather than a request. He tried, on one occasion, the specific combination of withdrawal and mild contempt that had been his most effective tool with Ren, the technique of making a person feel slightly insufficient without ever saying anything that could be directly addressed. The technique that operated through implication rather than declaration, that produced in its target a specific, corrosive self-doubt. Melissa noticed it on the second day. She called it by its correct name on the third. She said, "I know what you're doing. My father does it better than you and I grew up learning to identify it before he got through the first sentence. You're going to need a different approach." Ben stared at her. "Or," she said, "we can discuss what's actually bothering you. But the other thing won't work. I'm telling you this as a courtesy." He understood, in the weeks that followed, that he had married someone who had been raised by a man who operated in the register that Ben had only played at. Do Young Choi did not produce self-doubt through implication, he produced it through precision, through the accurate and complete identification of a person's actual situation and the patient delivery of that information at the moment it would land most effectively. Melissa had grown up watching this. She had developed the same precision without the same patience, because her mother Lorraine's influence had given her a directness that Du Young's methods lacked. She was, in effect, a faster and more immediate version of her father applied to the domestic scale. Ben had no tools for this. Everything he had built over 5 years with Ren had been built against a target that didn't fight back. Melissa fought back before he had finished the move. He felt, in the first 2 months, the specific disorientation of a person who has spent years learning one game and has been placed inside a different one. He called a friend from work named Overton on a Thursday evening when Melissa was out. He said he wasn't sure the marriage was working the way he'd expected. Overton, who had met Melissa twice and had a fairly clear picture of the situation, asked what specifically wasn't working. Ben tried to explain and found the explanation difficult to construct in terms that did not make him sound like someone who was bothered by a partner who had equal standing in their own home. Overton, who was a decent person, said, "It sounds like she's treating you the way you treated Ren." The silence that followed this sentence was the second most complete silence Ben Walker had experienced as an adult. The first had been in the hotel room with Do-Young's folder. "That's not the same," Ben said. "Okay," Overton said, with the tone of someone who has said the true thing and is not going to argue it into a person who isn't ready to receive it. Ben hung up. He sat in the apartment that he had moved into with Melissa, an apartment she had chosen, in a building that had certain tenants Ben had not noticed at first and noticed more as the months progressed, the kind of tenants who nodded at Melissa in the elevator with the specific, compressed acknowledgement of people within a known network. The kind of tenants who, on the one occasion when a situation in the parking garage had become momentarily uncomfortable for Melissa, had resolved it before Ben had processed that it needed resolving. He sat in the apartment and thought about Ren. About the kitchen table. About the way she had looked at him and said, "I know this isn't really about happiness." He had not thought about Ren at any length since the divorce. He had been too occupied with the next thing, then the next, then the proposal, then the wedding, then the first months of the marriage. But sitting alone on a Thursday evening with Overton's sentence in the room, he found himself thinking about her with the uncomfortable specificity of someone encountering a reflection they had been successfully avoiding. He had not been a good husband. He knew this, somewhere below the level of the story he told. He had been a husband who leveraged his wife's patience as a resource and had not noticed the cost of the leveraging until the resource was exhausted. He had found someone whose resource was not patience. He had found the consequence of his choices in the form of a person who had been raised by the practitioner of everything Ben had only been a student of. He sat in the apartment for a long time. Melissa came home at 10. She looked at his face and said, with the accuracy she brought to everything, "You've been thinking." "Yes," he said. "About anything useful?" He looked at her. "About whether I deserve this." She sat down. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, not the precision, not the management, but something more complex. The look of a woman who has been raised in the shadow of power and understands better than most people the difference between punishment and consequence. "That's the most honest thing you've said since we met," she said. The thing about Do-Young Choi, which Ben came to understand over the course of the first year of his marriage, was that his involvement in the life of his son-in-law was never dramatic and was never absent. It existed in the precise middle space between those two poles, present enough to be felt, contained enough to be undeniable, operating through the specific mechanisms of a man who had spent 40 years understanding that the most effective form of pressure was the kind that required no visible application. He called Melissa every Sunday. The calls lasted between 8 and 30 minutes, with the duration being no particular indicator of what had been discussed. He visited Nashville 4 times in the first year. Each visit was announced in advance, managed around the family schedule, and conducted with the conventional warmth of a father maintaining a relationship with his daughter. Each visit also contained, within its conventional structure, at least one direct, unambiguous exchange between Do-Young and Ben. These exchanges were not arguments. Do-Young did not argue. What he did was ask questions, the specific kind of question that is not a request for information but a delivery of it, framed as inquiry so that the recipient is placed in the position of confirming what is already known. On his second visit, he asked Ben how the relationship was developing. Ben said he thought they were finding their footing. Do-Young asked whether the footing Ben was finding was the one he had brought from his previous relationship or a new one. Ben said he was learning. "Good," Do-Young said. "Learning is the correct activity for someone in your position." On his third visit, he asked about Ben's work. The real estate firm was going through a restructuring and Ben's position had become less stable. Do-Young had not been told about this, as far as Ben knew, Melissa had not mentioned it. Ben's jaw tightened slightly at the precision of the question, and he answered it with the managed smoothness he kept for professional contexts and which, in front of Du Young, consistently felt like performing for an audience that had already read the script. Stability is important when you're building something, Du Young said. Instability in one area tends to reveal instability in others. Ben said he was managing it. Du Young nodded with the expression of someone who has made a note. The business connection arrived in the 4th month. It arrived through a man named Yusuf Kern, who introduced himself to Ben at an industry event as a commercial property consultant with connections to a Korean development group that was looking at Nashville expansion opportunities. Yusuf was polished and connected and represented an opportunity that Ben's restructuring complicated position made more attractive than it might otherwise have been. Ben said yes to a meeting. The meeting went well. A partnership was proposed, not large initially, a referral arrangement that would generate commission and connections. Ben signed the agreement. He mentioned it to Melissa that evening with the satisfied energy of a man who has turned a problem into an opportunity. Melissa was quiet for a moment. Yusuf Kern, she said. Yes. You know him? Another pause. The kind she sometimes took when she was deciding how much to say and in what order. He works with my father, she said. Ben set down his fork. With your father. For my father it is more accurate, she said. He's been with him for about 12 years. The apartment was very quiet. Did your father set this up? Ben asked. Melissa met his eyes. My father sets most things up, she said. He's been in this business for 40 years. He has connections in every room worth being in. She paused. He told me he wanted to see how you handled an opportunity. Whether you would verify it or just take it. Ben heard what was underneath this sentence. And I took it. You took it, she confirmed. Without judgment in her tone, with accuracy, which was worse. He was testing me. He was observing you, she said. There's a difference. A test assumes the outcome matters to the tester. An observation just establishes what's true. Ben thought about the folder on the hotel room table. About the Wednesday morning coffee. About I will be watching. Not occasionally. Consistently. In ways you will not always be able to see. He had been told. He had been told directly, in plain language, before the wedding. He had heard the words and had not fully believed them because he was a man who had operated for a long time without real consequences and had come to treat warnings the way he treated terms and conditions, as a formality that didn't require close reading. What does he do with the observations? Ben asked. Melissa looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not softening, exactly, but a recalibration. The specific look of a woman who has been watching someone encounter reality and is adjusting her positioning accordingly. He keeps them, she said. He's kept them about everyone in our family's life since before I was born. Every observation goes somewhere it can be retrieved. She picked up her fork. He doesn't use them immediately. He uses them when they become relevant. Are mine relevant? She looked at him with the directness that was her primary mode. They're becoming relevant, she said. Du Young Choi sent a man to Ben Walker's professional life to observe whether he would verify an opportunity or simply take it. Ben simply took it. Subscribe, because what Du Young does next is not what Ben expects and not what you're expecting either, and the reason behind it is the twist that changes the entire shape of this story. The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon in October, 14 months after the wedding. Du Young had requested it, again through Melissa, again framed as a one-on-one meeting, again at a location of his choosing. This time it was not a hotel. It was a house on the east side of Nashville that Ben had not previously known existed and that Du-Young apparently maintained as a base when his Nashville visits extended beyond the standard 2 or 3 days. The house was a Korean-style residence that had been modified and furnished with the precise taste of someone who understood what a home was for, not display, but function, comfort, the specific warmth of a space that was being genuinely inhabited rather than staged. There was a garden visible through the back windows that had been tended with the focused attention that careful gardeners bring to their work. It was not the space Ben had been constructing in his imagination when he thought about Du-Young Choi's private life. None of it matched the folder and the 2 men and the room-adjusting quality of his entrances. Du-Young made tea. He made it with the deliberate patience of a man who treated the preparation of a thing as part of the thing itself. He set 2 cups on the low table and sat across from Ben. He was quiet for a moment. Not the productive, information-gathering silence of the early meetings, something different. More considered. The silence of someone who has finished one calculation and is beginning another. "I have been watching you for 14 months, he said. Ben said nothing. "I have watched you learn that Melissa is not the kind of person your methods work on," Du-Young continued. "I have watched you encounter the specific frustration of a man who has spent years building a set of tools and found himself in an environment where none of them are applicable." He looked at Ben steadily. "I have watched you sit alone in your apartment on Thursday evenings and think." Ben thought about Overton. "About the thinking. You have people." "I have extensive visibility," Du-Young said simply. "This is not new information." Ben was quiet. "I also spoke with Ren Calloway again," Du-Young said. 2 months ago. "Not about you. I called to check on her. She is well. She is, by all appearances, considerably better than she was in the last 2 years of your marriage." He paused. "She asked about Melissa. I told her Melissa was fine. She said she was glad." He looked at his tea. "She said she didn't wish you harm. She said she hoped you were growing." The word growing sat in the room with the specific weight of things said by people who could have said something much sharper and chose not to. "Why are you telling me this?" Ben asked. "Because," Du-Young said, "I have been deciding what to do with what I know about you. I have been deciding this since the 3rd week after Melissa mentioned your name." He looked at Ben with the full, complete attention that had characterized every interaction. "I came to a conclusion last month." Ben waited. "You are not beyond correction," Du-Young said. This was not obvious at the beginning. A man who systematically removes dignity from a person who loves him is capable of doing so without full awareness of what he is doing, which does not diminish the harm but does affect what is possible afterward. He paused. "You have spent 14 months in a marriage that does not allow your previous habits to function. You have been forced, by the nature of who my daughter is, to encounter the reflection you avoided for 5 years. Is that what this was?" Ben said. "The marriage. The marriage is what it is," Du-Young said. "Melissa chose you. I did not arrange her feelings. What I arranged was the conditions. The apartment. The people in it. Yusuf Kern. I arranged the conditions that would prevent you from doing to my daughter what you did to Ren Calloway. I arranged them so that the habits would have no surface to land on." He was quiet for a moment. "I also arranged them because I believe that people who have not been given a sufficient reason to change do not change, and that sufficient reasons can sometimes be constructed." Ben looked at him. "You constructed the last 14 months, he said. "I contributed to the architecture," Du-Young said. "The choices were yours. What do you want from me?" Du-Young picked up his tea. He looked at the garden through the back windows. A man was there, tending something in the far corner with the patient attention of someone who had done this for years. I want to know if it worked, he said. Ben looked at his own hands. He thought about the kitchen table and Wren's face. He thought about Overton's sentence. He thought about Melissa saying that's the most honest thing you've said since we met. He thought about 14 months of encountering himself in a mirror that had no softening filter. I don't know yet, he said. Du-Young looked at him. That, he said, is the most honest answer you have given me. He refilled the tea. He did not speak for a long time. Outside, the gardener continued his work in the October afternoon. Inside, two men sat in a Korean-style house in Nashville, Tennessee, and something that had been in motion for 2 years reached, not its conclusion, but its turn. I should tell you what Wren Calloway was doing while all of this was happening. Not because her happiness requires his suffering as a precondition, it does not, and that is one of the things she understood better than most people would have, but because her story is the one the title points toward when it says peace, and it deserves to be told clearly. Wren left the kitchen table conversation and spent 2 weeks in the specific, clarifying grief of a person who has confirmed something they already knew and has been relieved of the labor of managing the not knowing. She filed the divorce paperwork without drama. She moved from the house they had shared to an apartment that she painted in a color she had wanted for years and that Ben had never liked. She called the friends she had been quietly managing her distance from over the 5 years of the marriage and found, almost without exception, that they had been waiting. She went back to work at the nonprofit with the particular, restored energy of a person who has been returned to themselves. She took a promotion she had declined twice during the marriage because Ben had made it clear, through the implication method he had refined over years, that her advancement made him uncomfortable in ways he would never directly acknowledge. She accepted the promotion with the decisive speed of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and understood that the right moment was simply the moment when the obstacle had been removed. She started running again. She had stopped during the marriage. She could not have told you when or why. It had happened the way things happened in that marriage, through the gradual accumulation of small discouragements that each passed beneath the threshold of grievance while building collectively into loss. She started running again in the spring after the divorce and found, on the first morning, that the city looked different from the angle she had when she was moving through it under her own power. She was not bitter. This is the specific quality of Wren Calloway that made her, to the people who loved her, extraordinary, and that made her, to Ben, something he had repeatedly mistaken for weakness. She was not bitter because bitterness requires investing ongoing energy in someone who has already taken enough, and Wren had understood from a very early age that her energy was a resource she was responsible for managing. She spoke to Du-Young Choi twice. The first time was a call she had not expected, several months before Ben's wedding, from a Korean man with a formal, precise voice who introduced himself as Melissa Choi's father, who said he was calling because he had heard Ben Walker's name in connection with his daughter and who said he understood if she preferred not to speak but that, if she was willing, he would like to understand more fully the history she had been part of. She could have declined. She chose not to, with the specific reasoning of a woman who had spent 5 years managing information about someone else's behavior and had grown tired of being its sole custodian. She was not unkind. She was accurate. She told Du-Young what the 5 years had actually contained, not the dramatic version, not the version that required raising her voice or producing a list of grievances, but the steady, factual version of what it had been like to live with a man who used patience as a resource without ever considering the cost. Du-Young listened. He said almost nothing during the call. At the end, he thanked her and said that he was sorry for what the marriage had cost her, and that he hoped the years going forward were proportional to what she had put in. She thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. It was, she told the friend she relayed the conversation to, the most precisely generous thing anyone had said to her in years. The second call, 2 months before this chapter, had been him checking on her. Asking how she was. Telling her Melissa was fine. She had asked about Ben, not with the urgency of someone who needed the information but with the genuine, low-level curiosity of someone who had once known a person well enough to wonder occasionally how the story had gone for them. Du Young said he thought Ben was in the process of something important. He did not say what. She said she hoped it was true. She meant it. This is the thing about Ren Calloway that cannot be reduced to a narrative function or a moral point. She genuinely hoped, from a distance of 2 years and a new life and a color on her apartment wall and morning runs through a city that looked different from the right angle, that Ben Walker was becoming someone better than he had been when she knew him. Not for her sake. Because she had loved him once, and love, even the exhausted, final version of it at a kitchen table, leaves something behind that isn't quite erasable. Ben Walker called Ren 3 months after the tea in Du Young's house. He had not called her since the divorce, and calling her now was the hardest thing he had done, which itself told him something about the category of difficulty he had been operating in. She answered. He said he had been thinking about what she had said at the kitchen table. About what she had known that he hadn't been honest enough to admit yet. She was quiet for a moment. "It took you a while," she said. Not unkindly. "It took a Korean Mafia boss and 14 months of marriage to get me there," he said. She laughed. Not the polite laugh, the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine. "Du Young is efficient," she said. "He told me you were doing well." "I am," she said. "I'm glad," he said. And meant it, which was the thing that made it worth saying and the thing that made it arrive correctly on her end. They spoke for 22 minutes. He did not ask for forgiveness. He was not, yet, certain he had earned the right to ask for it, and he had learned enough in 14 months to understand that asking before earning was another version of the old habit. He said he was sorry. He said it without qualification or management or the mitigating language he had spent 5 years developing. She received it the way she received most things, with clarity rather than performance. She said, "I know." And that was enough. For that conversation, on that morning, with the running shoes by her front door and the color on her wall and the city waiting outside, it was exactly enough. Du Young Choi, when Melissa told him about the call, was quiet for a moment. "And what do you think?" Melissa asked. He considered this. "I think a man who has been willing to be taught for 14 months and has made the phone call is a different man than the one in the folder," he said. "What he does with the difference is the relevant question." "You're still watching," Melissa said. "I am always watching," he said. "That is not punishment. That is how I protect what I love." He paused. "But the watching has a different quality now." "What quality?" "Interest," he said. "Rather than concern." Melissa told Ben this. He sat with it for a while. Then he went for a run. He had started running 2 months prior, had not told anyone why, and thought about the difference between interest and concern as categories of attention, and what it meant to be someone whose story had moved from one column to the other, and whether the moving was the beginning or the middle or the end. He thought it was probably the beginning. He was, for possibly the first time in the relevant history, right. The end. From a kitchen table in Nashville to a hotel room folder to 14 months of a marriage that functioned as the most precisely constructed consequence in the history of domestic arrangements, Ben Walker's story proves that the universe does not require thunder to deliver a lesson. It requires patience, a father with extensive visibility, and a daughter who was raised to return everything that was given to her in exact proportion. Ren Calloway painted her apartment, got her promotion, and started running again. Ben Walker made a phone call that cost him more than anything in his professional life and contained fewer than 200 words and was, for once, completely free of management. Du Young Choi moved the watching from concern to interest. And somewhere in Nashville, a Korean-style house has a garden that gets tended every Sunday morning by a man who believes that the preparation of a thing is part of the thing itself. Hit subscribe for next week's story. A woman discovers on her first day at a prestigious law firm that the senior partner who hired her is the same man who testified against her father in a trial that destroyed her family, 12 years ago. She has one deposition, 6 hours, and a file that changes everything. The ending will completely floor you. See you there. Real talk. Was Do-young Choi's 14-month architecture of consequences for Ben Walker justice, parenting, or something that goes beyond either category? A. Justice. Ben needed to encounter the reflection he had been avoiding, and Do-young constructed the mirror. B. Parenting. He protected his daughter in the only way that would actually work on the specific person she had chosen. C. Something beyond either. A man who calls a divorced woman to check on her well-being and tells her the years going forward should be proportional to what she put in, is operating from a moral framework that doesn't have a simple name. D. All three, and I need someone to confirm that Do-young Choi is the most methodically decent person in this story despite being described as ruthless in the title. Drop your answer below. And tell us, do you believe people can genuinely change when the circumstances force them to encounter themselves honestly? Or does change require the person to choose it before it counts? Also, Ren said she genuinely hoped Ben was becoming someone better. Not for his sake, just because she had loved him once and love leaves something behind. Do you think that kind of generosity is wisdom, or is it simply who some people are? Sound off in the comments. Because this story is about something very specific. What happens when the tools a person built for the wrong life stop working and they have to decide whether to build different tools or keep trying the old ones? What do you think?